as we continue our look at one of the classes in issues in the Christian world. We've been looking at, can the promise of 2 Chronicles 7:14 save America? Understanding this verse in context. Now, the context of chapter 6, we looked at it at the first lesson. It's clearly a prayer of Solomon for the nation of Israel. There is no reason, justifiable reason, to apply it to any other nation. It is very specific as who it is addressed to. The nation of Israel. It's clearly the context. In Solomon's prayer of chapter 6, there are two covenants that are referenced. Both are important in understanding the context of chapter 7, specifically the promise of 2 Chronicles 7, verse 14. In verse 14 of chapter 6, we are told, which keepeth covenant. Now, what covenant is this referring to? I believe it's referring to the Mosaic covenant. The surrounding context in chapter 6 is the promise of blessing and cursing, which is dependent on the obedience or disobedience of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 28, for example. If you remember back in the giving of the Mosaic law and promises to Israel, in the beginning of chapter 28, first 14 verses, we'll look at a couple of those shortly, are blessings for the nation of Israel if they obey the Mosaic covenant. But from verse 15 on, it's talking about cursings and many, many more verses if they disobey. So the keeping of the covenant that's referenced in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 14, is the Mosaic covenant. Here are the blessings, just a couple of the verses of the blessings in Deuteronomy 28. In verse 1, and it shall come to pass, if thou, Jewish people, nation of Israel, people of Israel, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all the nations of the earth. Keep the commandments, nation of Israel. And if you do, the majority of the nation keeping the commandments, you will be blessed, you will be exalted, you will be set on high above all nations of the earth. Verse 12, and the Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure, the heaven to give the rain unto the land in his season, and to bless all the work of thine hand. And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow. Israel, Jewish people, people of Israel, the nation of Israel, obey my commandments. And if you do, nationally, I'm not looking for perfection here. God is not asking of that. But as a nation, if they would follow, generally speaking, the Mosaic covenant, I will exalt thee above all the nations on the earth. Not only that, I'm going to give you the rain in its due season. I'm going to bless the work of your hand. And you're going to be a lender to the nations and not a borrower, because of all the blessings I will pour upon you. Well, in the first 14 verses, we have the blessing promises to Israel under the Mosaic covenant. But starting in verse 15, and going for many, many verses, and a few chapters actually, we have the cursings. Verse 15, But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. So if the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, don't follow the commandments of God, instead of the blessings, the cursings. What are some of these cursings? Verse 23 and 24. And thy heaven that is over thy head shall be brass. The earth that is under thee shall be iron. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust. From heaven shall it come down upon thee until thou be destroyed. You disobey, you're not going to get the blessings of the harvest. You're going to have drought. You're going to have famine. You're going to have destruction as a nation if you disobey me. And it goes on with all kinds of other detrimental things to the people of Israel if they disobey God. They don't follow the Mosaic covenant. Now, to return to the blessing promises of Deuteronomy 28, the nation needs to turn back to God. The blessing promises of the Mosaic covenant, Deuteronomy 28, is for Israel. It's not for the United States. It's not for any nation in Europe. It's not for Russia. It's for Israel. And if they would turn back to God, in the above particular promise that I read, the blessing of rain would fall upon the land, producing eventually a harvest and food and the blessings that he had promised in the first part of Deuteronomy chapter 28. But then we have this in verse 16. Keep with thy servant David, my father, that which thou hast promised him, David, saying, there shall not fail thee a man in my sight to sit upon the throne of Israel. Now, although the phrase covenant is not found in verse 16, this is clearly speaking of the Davidic covenant. Keep with your servant David my father, Solomon is saying, that which thou hast promised him. What had been promised to David? The Davidic covenant. That there would be a king to sit upon the throne of Israel. Ultimately, that's speaking of the Messiah, of Jesus. This verse refers to the Davidic covenant. That, by the way, is the seed promise of Genesis 12:2 of the Abrahamic covenant. God made a covenant with David. And we're going to look at one passage where it's found. There's a number of places in Scripture we see this. That there will be a son of David that would ultimately sit on the throne of David, ruling in Jerusalem. That is, ultimately speaking of Jesus. Now, Solomon appeals to God for his mercies based on the unconditional, eternal promise of the Davidic covenant. And we're going to look at Psalm 89. In verse 28 of Psalm 89, we are told this: my mercy will I keep for him forevermore, and my covenant shall stand fast with him. Him is David. God's mercy, God's covenant, the Davidic covenant it's referred to as, will last forever, stand fast with him, David, forever. In verse 29, it says this: his seed, the seed of David, also will I make to endure forever, and his throne is the days of heaven. The promise of God of a king to sit on the throne of David, to rule and reign is an eternal promise that will never, ever be broken. It doesn't matter what Israel does. It doesn't matter what the Jewish people do. That's what the next verse tells us. If his children forsake my law and walk not in my judgments, if they break my statutes and keep not my commandments. So if the children of Israel, the Jewish people and the descendants of David forsake the law of God, walk not in the judgments of God, break his statutes, don't keep his commandments, it doesn't matter. God says, then will I visit their transgression with a rod and their iniquity with stripes. I will discipline them because of their rebelliousness, their sinfulness. Nevertheless, God says, my loving kindness will I not utterly take from him, nor suffer my faithfulness to fail. See, the promise of the Davidic covenant, which comes out of the Abrahamic covenant and the seed promise, is unconditional. It is based on God's faithfulness. So my loving kindness, God says, will not fail, will not be taken from David and his seed. Verse 34, my covenant will I not break, nor alter the thing that is gone out of my lips. I have sworn. I have made a promise, God says. I will not break that promise. Verse 35, once have I sworn by my holiness, that I will not lie unto David. He swore by his uniqueness, his holiness. He would not lie unto David. And God says, his seed, the seed of David, shall endure forever, and his throne is the sun before me. There will be a child, a son of David, to sit upon the throne of David in Jerusalem. That is certain. It matters not what the nation of Israel does. The Davidic covenant. Now, our next lesson, we'll look at the promise of 2 Chronicles 7:14 as we get into that chapter. And put it into context with the 6th chapter, with the Mosaic covenant and the Davidic covenant placed in our understanding as well of the promise of 2 Chronicles 7:14. So until our next lesson, shalom.